The sun rose over the arid plains of southern Afghanistan, casting a golden glow on the dry earth where history was about to be written in blood and bravery. It was July of the year 1880, and the British Empire believed it could bend the tribal lands to its will. But the people of Maiwand, a small region near Kandahar, held a different fate in their hearts. Led by courage and not cannons, by pride and not politics, they stood ready to defend their soil from an empire that had never truly understood the spirit of the Afghan warrior. The British had been expanding their reach into the region, forcing treaties and puppet rulers in the name of order and diplomacy. But the Afghans saw only invasion and dishonor among the towering cliffs and sun-baked rocks. Whispers of rebellion echoed from village to village, soon gathering into a roar of resistance under the banner of faith, honor, and land, from the highlanders in the hills to the nomads in the plains. Tribes once divided found unity in rage, a rage sparked by betrayal and fed by ancestral memory. The British column, led by Brigadier General George Burroughs, marched across the landscape with confidence but not understanding their rifles, polished their boots gleaming, their eyes blind to what awaited in the heart of the desert. The plan was to intercept Ayub Khan, a prince of Afghanistan, leading a growing force toward Kandahar to reclaim what he believed was his birthright to the British. He was a rebel to the people. He was a symbol of defiance. Soldiers in red coats moved like shadows across, the dust stirring fear and resentment among locals. The British camped near Maiwand, unaware that they were walking into the furnace of fate. Ayub Khan's army was no ragtag militia. It was a sea of warriors, many with nothing but swords and old muskets, but hearts burning like fire. Among them walked a young girl named Malalai, just a teenage village girl, yet her spirit would rise like a storm. Her voice would one day echo louder than cannon fire. As the British scouts reported movement ahead, they did not expect numbers so vast. They thought it was a minor force. They thought wrong. Ayub Khan's army was waiting, hiding beneath the dunes behind the ridges, ready to strike like the sandstorm that gives no warning. Burroughs received the first reports with calm. He believed his guns and discipline would prevail against the tribal wave. They had, after all, conquered lands far and wide. How could these barefoot tribes pose a threat? But as the morning mist lifted, the scale of the enemy became visible, thousands strong, stretching across the horizon. The Afghans were not coming, they were already there. The first shots rang out in the heat of noon. Rifles cracked across the wasteland. Both sides exchanged fire, but the Afghans moved fast, swift like wolves around the flanks. Their cavalry thundered through the dry earth surrounding the British, who found themselves shrinking in space yet holding their lines. The British artillery opened fire with precision. Cannons roared and the battlefield shook. But the Afghans pushed forward, undeterred, chanting cries of Allahu Akbar filling the air with the spirit of resistance. It was then that Malalai stepped forward. Wounded flag bearers had fallen. The moral line wavered, and it was she who picked up the flag and shouted words that cut through fear. "If you do not fight today, you will be shamed forever," she cried, running into the storm. Her scarf lifted as a banner, her voice becoming the soul of an army. British troops began to fall one by one, their formation cracking under the unrelenting tide of passion and numbers. Water ran dry, ammunition ran low. The heat unforgiving, the enemy endless. Burroughs ordered fallback, but the circle was closing too fast. Each retreating step met with ambush and blade. The British cavalry tried to break through the Afghan lines, but the tribes had learned the terrain well. Every hill, every rock was a trap, and soon the retreat became a massacre. Yet in that chaos, the courage of both sides lit the sky. British medics tending to the wounded under fire officers leading desperate charges. Afghan elders fighting beside boys barely of age, one side with pride, one side with empire. The land soaked it all in, recording silently every act of honor and horror. As the sun began to dip low and shadows stretched long across the desert, Burroughs realized the battle was lost, but honor demanded they not surrender. At least not yet. Men looked to their leaders and found only death in their gaze. The ground shook again as Afghan reinforcements poured in. Now the British were not just outgunned, they were surrounded. Hope grew thinner than smoke rising from broken guns in a final desperate attempt to hold. A line. Burroughs formed a square formation, a classic tactic of discipline. But the Afghans were too many and too close. The square collapsed, and what followed was an hour of confusion. screams and sand turning red. The British lost their flag, their formation, their direction, and in that moment they also lost their aura of invincibility. But somewhere amid the chaos, Malalai fell a bullet, finding her heart. Yet she died with the banner still high, her story not ending but beginning in the hearts of every fighter around her, and the name of Maiwand etched forever in the memory of empires as darkness settled, and the wind carried cries of both agony and victory. The desert bore witness to the power of a people who refused to kneel the British survivors. Those few who escaped wandered through the night, some wounded, some in shock, all forever changed. They would carry back the tale not just of defeat, but of spirit, of how empire met resistance and resistance did not blink. But this was only the beginning, for the echoes of Maiwand were far from over, and the ghosts of that day would haunt the empire for years to come. For what had happened at Maiwand was more than a battle. It was a reckoning. As dawn rose over the battlefield of Maiwand, the cries of the night had faded into silence, leaving only the broken earth as a witness to what had occurred. Corpses lay scattered across the sands. Red coats mixed with tribal garments. Muskets, swords shattered, cannons burned out. The British defeat was total, but the weight of that defeat was heavier than statistics or strategy. It was a wound not just to the army, but to the pride of the empire. Word of the battle reached Kandahar like a thunderclap. The once confident garrison now watched the horizon with unease. Knowing statistics or strategy, it was a wound not just to the army, but to the pride of the empire. Word of the battle reached Kandahar like a thunderclap. The once confident garrison now watched the horizon with unease, knowing the tribes had achieved the unthinkable victory over a modern European force. Whispers grew in the barrack stories of Malalai, the village girl turned martyr of Burrows. Last stand of the British men who died with honor and confusion. Both the British Empire would later send reinforcements and retake some land, but Maiwand would never truly be retaken. It belonged now to legend, to the spirit of the people who had fought with nothing but resolve and identity, to those who saw in dust and blood a chance to remind the world that Afghanistan was no colony to be ruled, but a land of warriors. The survivors of the British side were few. Those who lived returned not as victors but as shadows, men whose minds carried more scars than their bodies. They spoke of how the tribes came from nowhere, how the women sang on the battlefield, how even in death the Afghans refused to let go of the soil beneath them. British newspapers tried to explain the loss, blaming terrain, heat, even betrayal, but none could deny what had happened was more than a military event. It was a spiritual blow, an awakening of native pride against foreign arrogance back in England. The defeat was met with shock and discomfort. The British public had long been fed tales of empire glory, civilizing missions and easy victories, but Maiwand cracked that illusion. It reminded the people that beyond the seas were cultures older, stronger, and sometimes braver than the empire itself. Military scholars analyzed the battle, looking for errors, tactical flaws. They noted how Burrows misjudged numbers, how supply lines had failed, how the terrain had favored the Afghans. But beneath every report lay an unspoken truth. They underestimated the will to resist a will that had no uniform, no doctrine, but ran like fire through the veins of tribes who had only their land and their God on their side. In Afghanistan, the Battle of Maiwand became a symbol not just of victory, but of unity. It was one of the rare moments when tribal divisions were set aside for a common cause. The fight against foreign rule songs were written, poems carved in memory of the martyrs. Malalai became a folk hero. Statues would be built in her honor, girls named after her, in hopes they too would one day stand tall when their people needed them. The British eventually moved on, drawing new borders, making new treaties, but they would never again look at Afghanistan as a simple place to occupy. The lesson of Maiwand stayed in the minds of generals and politicians alike, reminding them that not all battles are about weapons. Some are about soul and belief. Even decades later, when other wars were fought and other lands conquered, Afghanistan remained a place of caution and respect for those who wore the red coat. The ghosts of Maiwand walked the hills long after the last gun had gone silent in the villages around. Maiwand old men still speak of that day with reverence, their voices crackling like dry leaves as they recall how the dust rose, how the sky trembled and how even the earth seemed to cry out as brothers' sons, fathers ran toward gunfire with nothing but prayer on their lips. The young listened not as passive ears but as heirs of a legacy. A reminder that courage is not born from bullets but from the refusal to bow. British historians, over the years, would soften the narrative, calling Maiwand a tragic miscalculation or a misunderstood clash, but in Afghanistan it was none of those things. It was a declaration. A moment when a people too often written off by history wrote their own chapter in their own blood and voice, and when they wrote it they did not whisper, they roared for the empire. The loss at Maiwand forced a re-evaluation of tactics in frontier warfare. The need to understand culture, terrain, and local politics became central to any future mission. Yet understanding could never replace the reality that in Afghanistan, the land itself breathes resistance. Every rock, every river, every ridge carries the story of those who fought and those who fell long after the British Empire dissolved and its colonies gained independence. The memory of Maiwand stayed alive in textbooks and oral tradition in both London and Kabul. British military museums feature relics from that battle. With quiet solemnity, Afghan schools teach children about Malalai with pride. The battlefield now, a site of remembrance, stands quiet under the same sun that once watched thousands clash, not as enemies of blood but of belief and legacy. As we look back today on the Battle of Maiwand, we see more than two sides. We see a mirror reflecting what happens when arrogance meets resolve, when empire underestimates identity, and when history is not written by the most powerful, but by those who refuse to be erased. The battle was not just Afghan versus British. It was the past challenging the future, tradition confronting modernity, and faith standing against force. And in that confrontation, but not forgotten, they can be defeated in body but not in memory. They can lose a war but still win the story. The British Empire may have had guns, ships, and maps, but on that July day in 1880, the Afghan tribes had something stronger. They had nothing to lose and everything to protect, and that made them invincible.